I've got to teach you how to do flare leg jeans or bell bottom jeans. I used to make these all the time when I was a kid. There was a time where all of my pants had bell bottoms in them. Of course, that was a long time ago, but that style's kind of coming back. So I figured this is a perfect time to teach you how to do it. The first thing you want to do is figure out how big of a bell bottom you want to add to your pants. Of course, this could go all the way up to the hip, and I once made really, really, really big bell bottoms that went all the way up to the hip. It was almost like wearing a skirt. But, of course, you could keep it a lot more subtle and a lot smaller. And what I ended up doing was just measuring about 10.5 inches from the bottom of the jeans and ripping that much with my seam ripper. I did opt for raw edge pants. These needed to be hemmed, and I'm feeling lazy and I didn't feel like hemming them, so I just sliced clean off the bottom, and that's okay. You don't have to have these hemmed. If you want to have them hemmed though, make sure to leave yourself about 1/2 of an inch or so of space so that way you can turn the edge under. So I've cut this open, and I'm going to walk you through how to do this on this leg I haven't altered yet. So I'm going to take my ruler and measure up 10.5 inches and place a pin there. And then I'm just going to take a sharp seam ripper and start ripping open the seam. And with jean fabric, there's usually 2 lines of stitching. There's usually a line of stitching that's the color of the jean fabric, and then there's usually an orange or yellowish color of thread below that. So there's 2 layers of thread here, and it takes a little while and it is really messy. So just take your time and be careful, because it's really easy to skip off of the identical colored stitches and, yeah, see, I just did it, rip into the jean fabric. You want to try and avoid doing that if you can. It's not the end of the world. We'll definitely be able to still work with that and finish it, but just take it slow and rip open from the bottom of the jeans up to the point where you want your bell to end. So I've taken some time to rip this seam just 10 inches from the bottom, and now I'm playing around kind of opening up this bell to see how wide I want it at space. And yes, you could go as wide as you want, but sometimes if you go super wide and it's not very long, it can end up making the bell kind of bulge out oddly from your pants. So I like to go with something a little bit more narrow, like that, and it's rather subtle. It doesn't have to be massively huge. When I was a kid, I didn't realize that. As an adult now, I can appreciate subtlety. So now I'm gonna just measure this bottom edge, and that's about 4 inches, and that looks really suitable to me. So it's about 10.5 inches long by 4 inches wide. Okay, so now I'm gonna create a pattern. I've already done this. Basically what I did was I took 2 freezer paper sheets and I pressed them together, and then I drew a straight line down the center and a perpendicular line across, so I knew that that was nice 90-degree angles. And this perpendicular line, I made sure that was 4 inches wide. And then I took my ruler and placed the 10.5 inch mark on that edge, and then brought the tip to that center line, and that created my angle. I did that on both sides, and that created the wedge shape or triangle shape for our flare. And then I used the ruler to give me an extra 1/2 inch on both sides. That's my seam allowance. So I took this template, because it's freezer paper, it was sticky on one side, pressed it to the fabric, cut out that triangle, and just left a little extra space down here. That's going to help it go together. So that was how I created this pattern. Now let's take it to the machine and start stitching it together. So I've turned my pants legs wrong side out, and now I'm just aligning the edge with the edge of the flare that I've cut. Okay, and we're just going to get started stitching. Take a few stitches forward and then back stitch. And then I'm going to stitch this on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You might have a guide for that on your machine on the needle plate, and that's really handy. If you don't, just try and eyeball it the best you can. And just keep those edges in nice alignment. I did pin down here. The tip of the flare comes into that joint. I don't want to stitch too far. I want to make sure to stop right where my seam ripping ended, right where I stopped ripping that pants leg open. So my first seam was always from the bottom to the top, and my second seam is always from the top to the bottom. And I always did it this way because it helped to sort out any kind of weird pleating, puckering weirdness that can sometimes happen right where the bell ends at that tip. So I always did it this way and just kind of sorted out the fabric, got it nice and flat. And then you do have to kind of cram it underneath your foot because there's a lot of different layers right here at the tip of that bell, but I think it's going to work out just fine. So again, you're going to get started stitching and back stitch to secure. And then just simply align the edge of that pants leg with the edge of the fabric. And yes, it is going to start fraying on you. As you can see, mine's fraying pretty badly, but don't worry, we're going to finish this edge with some zigzag stitching next. So now I'm buzzing back over the seam with a zigzag stitch, and then I'll trim away this excess fabric and kind of trim down that seam allowance, and that's going to reduce all of this raw, kind of messy frayed edge. And now the final step is just to trim away the excess kind of rough edges, all that kind of nasty, thready kind of extra stuff on the edge beyond the zigzag stitching. And you can see that cleans it up nicely, and now these pants can be washed and they're not going to fray so bad because of the zigzag. So here's what the finished bell bottom looks like. It fits in there really nicely, and it just extends that leg outward just a little bit. But here's something that's really important. You want to make sure that your pants are long enough that the bell is going to drag the ground. And the reason is something about adding the extra fabric and poofing out the leg. If it's not dragging the ground, they end up looking really weird. So I realized that I'd made a mistake and I cut off too much fabric here. So the solution is, of course, to add an extender, and that's just add extra fabric to the end of the pants leg. And this would work whether you would add it a bell bottom or not. You can just cut the hem off of a pair of pants and do this anytime. So what I've done is just added about 4 inches of fabric to the end, and then I've also gone around with decorative stitching and lime green bright thread, and that's really added to the whole look. And then now they are more than long enough and they're going to look great. So I'm going to show you how to do this to this leg step by step. So I've cut a 4-inch strip of this purple fabric, and I'm getting started. This is the inside seam of the pants, and I'm folding this over, and you can see I'm kind of folding this at an angle. I want this part to also flare outward on the bottom. So I want to fold that at a slight angle here and make sure that that fold is lining up with that seam on the side of the pants. So now I'm going to slip the whole thing underneath my foot and start stitching. So just get started slowly, and then of course back stitch. That's going to secure it. And then just take it about 2 inches or so at a time, lining up our extending fabric and the edge of the pants. And I'm sewing this on with about 1/2 inch seam allowance. So as you near this folded beginning edge, all you're going to do is just lay the fabric over it, and we're going to stitch right on top. We're just going to overlap the beginning and end right over each other, and try and maintain the same the seam allowance, so that way the stitches will end up right on top of each other. And again, we'll back stitch to secure and break thread. So we've got some extra fabric here from this extension, and I'm just going to trim it off. We've got a lot of extra here, so that way we can connect this together, and the way to know how to do that is to unfold the whole thing and kind of smooth it out. And then we want this extension to also have a subtle flare too. It'll make the bell bottom seem a little bit bigger. It'll go with the direction of the pants as well. You know, if we brought it inward, it would look kind of, well, weird. So we want this to also flare too. So what I'm going to do is just slightly tug on this fabric to have it at an angle, and then also have this fold where we started, that fold at a subtle angle, And that looks really good. And so now I'm just going to stitch right over this with a straight seam, and that's just going to stitch that fold in place and secure those edges together. So here is that line of stitching, and the next step is to run around the bell and then the extension here and into the bell, the flare area, with a decorative stitch, and that's going to really make this stand out. It's also going to flatten out the fabric nicely so it has a nice crisp fold. And I should add that this decorative stitching is decorative. It's not actually 100% necessary. If you wanted it to be there but did not want it to show off as much as mine, then of course you could match your thread color. You could do navy blue thread here over the blue jean part and then switch to a purple thread that matches this color for the bell and the extension. That would be perfectly fine. So the very last step is to go back over that first line of stitching for your hem with your decorative stitching. And I'm just trying to stay right on top of that line of thread, trying to stay right on top of it as I stitch that back and forth stitch. So it's a little bit of an extra step, but I really think that that looks so pretty, and it really makes the stitching and the bell bottom stand out nicely on the pants. So that's it for this video. You can see my cute pants and how they came out. I'm so delighted with them. It's a subtle bell bottom. It's a lot of fun to wear, and I might even bling it up a little bit with some, maybe some embroidery or something else. So it was a lot of fun to create. Until next time, let's go quilt.